This event is brought to you by Disability Rights New York and the New York State Special Education Task Force. And as many of you know, this is a very timely topic. As noted by Governor Hochul in Tuesday's State of the State address, mental health issues, including anxiety, have reached the status of a public health emergency in this post-pandemic world. Students are likewise impacted. According to a recent New York Times survey of school counselors across the country, schools are seeing a marked increase in anxiety among students. The counselors consistently noted the negative impacts of anxiety on academic performance and stamina, emotional and behavioral regulation, and social relationships among students. So we are very excited to learn from our wonderful panel of experts in this area. We have joining us today Lindsey Pensabene, who is a licensed social worker with a master's degree in mental health counseling. She is a therapist with ECS Psychological Services in Saratoga. We have Shari Rosato, who just retired from an 11-year tenure as Director of Pupil Personnel Services at Schalmont Central Schools. Prior to that, Shari was an elementary school principal. And last but certainly not least is Marion Walsh, who is an experienced attorney with the law firm Littman Krooks, LLP in Westchester. Marion has specialized in special education law for over 20 years. I just want to do a quick overview of today's agenda. We have a very packed agenda. First, Lindsey will start us off with an overview of school anxiety and its sources. Shari will then provide insight on what schools are seeing. Marion will then discuss how disability rights laws, including the IDEA and Section 504, can help address the needs of students with anxiety. After that, all of our panelists will discuss the strategies and best practices to address school anxiety. And finally, the panelists will talk about bullying as a source of student anxiety and what can be done about it. We have reserved the last 20 minutes or so of this presentation for questions from viewers. If you have a question, please share it in the chat. Please do not include personal information, and I will share the questions with the panel for discussion as time allows at the end. The moderators will be focused on their presentations and likely will not be monitoring the chat. However, I will be monitoring the chat. We will also be offering several polls during this presentation. Your feedback and use of these polls is very valuable. Please participate. So with that, let's get started, and I will turn it over to Lindsey.
Okay, so I just wanted to start off with giving an interview or an overview of anxiety. So as many of you may have noticed, this generation of students has become much more knowledgeable about mental health than my generation did. Anxiety has become a household word. So I think it's important to talk a little bit about what it is to make sure we're all on the same page. It gets used a lot by, kids as young as elementary school level to parents to teachers. So let's just clear up what it is. Most of us, when we hear anxiety, we have a negative connotation. We think that it's something bad, which sometimes it is. But in general, anxiety is an intense and excess worry or fear about everyday situations. So in extreme amounts, this can be debilitating, but anxiety can also be a good thing. So it can present in seemingly adaptive ways, like overachieving, perfectionism, or extreme organization. The pictures on this page demonstrate all kinds of different types of students we may see who may be anxious, also some different behaviors they may display. But anxiety motivates us and it mobilizes our body's resources for action. every single person on this webinar today had some kind of anxiety this morning. So maybe you wanted to go back to sleep, and anxiety about, you know, keeping your job may have gotten you out of bed. Or maybe someone you love is impacted by anxiety and is having a hard time getting to school or functioning in school. And your anxiety is simply your love and desire to help them overcome that and work through it. So either way, we all experience anxiety. It just shows up in a lot of different ways. So it's typical and appropriate to worry about things in life like the ones I just mentioned. But for most folks, when the situation is actually resolved, we tend to let it go and move on. Some folks can't, and that's usually when we see some kind of anxiety disorder. The human body, it works around the clock. It keeps us safe and breathing and gives us what we need for survival. So anxiety essentially is communication. It's the brain's way of prompting us to check our environment for threats so that we can protect ourselves. Before civilization, when the world was wild, people were hunters and gatherers, and they lived in groups to increase their chance of survival. So if an external threat, like say a bear, were to show up, these folks needed to rely on their survival instinct to survive and respond accordingly. So when humans encounter something they perceive as a threat, like a bear, this is a silly picture and it's Photoshopped. Don't worry, these people are all, I'm assuming, safe. The body's autonomic nervous system triggers our fight or flight response. So this means that when the brain registers that bear, we enter survival mode. We either run away or we stay and fight. So it's important to note my silly example of the bear, which is just an extreme example of a threat, but everybody's nervous system is wired differently and it's activated by different things. So before the pandemic, our students were already anxious. Let's just put that out there to start with, especially our friends who have co-occurring disabilities. They were anxious due to a number of different stressors, things like timed tests, social demands, being expected to sit in one place and follow directions, figuring out who to sit with at lunch, play with at recess. I think we've all felt the anxiety of being asked to read in front of the class or answer a question, which can immediately send somebody into a swirl of panic. So et cetera, the school environment is filled with anxiety. But when we talk about fight or flight, we tend to think very literally about running from a bear or, you know, protecting ourselves. But when we see these responses in students, it tends to look a bit different. So when students' fight response is activated, we might see things like frustration, anger, impatience, and negative self-talk. But when a student's flight response is activated, we might see behaviors like avoidance. So maybe not doing homework or procrastinating, school refusal, eloping, which is leaving the space, defiance, trips to the nurse, and so on. Avoidance shows up all the time in conspicuous little behaviors like, you know, going to the bathroom every time math starts. But we have some sources of anxiety that are pretty constant across the board, and everybody's had a different experience, and this is in no way an inclusive list of things that cause anxiety. But the first thing I've got is transitions. You know, change is against human beings' nature, and we fight it and resist it as much as possible. And when we can't resist it, it tends to be hard and often very anxiety-inducing. Parents are very anxious and emotional these days. The pandemic really threw us all into a tailspin. Parents have been the ones who have been responsible for all of the behind-the-scenes work to get these kids educated, learning the regulations and safety guidelines, trying to teach the kids what they need to know, packing masks, testing, etc. Parents are the ones who are consuming all of the information and media and making the decisions that they feel are best for their family. But also it's important to note that parents talk to each other and kids hear. They hear everything. They hear when their parents talk negatively about other parents who choose to vaccinate or not vaccinate, parents who choose to mask or not mask. They hear their parents who, you know, may make a choice to kind of, you know, make fun of other parents for their choices. And then they bring their opinions into school. Schools have new ways of doing old things. So you've got your established students who are used to the routine of school, but those things have all changed now. There's masking protocols. There's deciding whether or not you want to be vaccinated if you're eligible. There's constantly changing protocol, and there has been for the last couple of years. We've got mixed messages coming from schools and administrations. You know, guidelines everywhere say stay home when you feel sick. But if you stay home when you feel sick and you miss a whole bunch of days of school, then you're hearing from the school about how you're not there often enough and your attendance is poor. So it's really this kind of vicious cycle. We've got constantly changing social landscape. So the social landscape, you know, ask any student, it's difficult to start with, but I think the pandemic really put some unique situations in our laps where we saw restructuring of friend groups, whether it was based on what the family was doing safety wise or their vaccination choices, or whether it was who was available to you. We saw some friend groups getting restructured. And so maybe 30 kids would have hung out before, but now you're only hanging out with 4 or 5. It was interesting that I found high school kids especially were behaving kind of like amateur contact tracers when they came back to school. If you got the sniffles, they felt like they had to explain, well, I only have a cold, I tested, I don't have COVID, I was hanging out with this person and that person, everybody there is healthy and vaccinated. It's been pretty wild. So their social demands really got heightened and escalated, let's call it that. So the pandemic learning experience has been an interesting one. And if anything, it has really driven across, I think, the point that most of us probably already know, that everyone learns differently. And we saw a lot of different results from pandemic schooling. So the online learning experience has been a very divisive topic. Some students thrived and loved it, and some students struggled and hated it. So for some students, online learning provided this environment where they could just be themselves and not distract anybody else's learning. They needed to fidget, they were allowed to fidget. Stand up, take breaks, they could go to the bathroom, get a snack whenever they wanted it without having to ask permission or get a pass or any of that stuff. Some students had access to an adult who could help them stay on task and attend to the work that they were doing. Maybe they could answer questions. When everyone shifted back to in-person learning, that choice to learn remotely or in person was taken away. And these students were forced to change back to a system that doesn't necessarily work as well for them. So on the other hand, we also have challenges with online learning. I don't know if you've ever taken an online class, but it can be really hard to attend to what you're supposed to be doing, especially if you're not super passionate about it. Some struggle more than others with online learning. Some didn't have that adult that was available to them and they floundered. We had special education students who weren't receiving the support and services that were essential for their educational plan. I heard students explain sometimes that by the time they formulated their question and unmuted themselves to ask, the teacher was on to the next topic and they were too embarrassed to interrupt or slow them down. The return to in-person learning was pretty hairy, as we all expected, I think. As excited as a lot of folks were to return to an in-person setting, there was a lot of anxiety around this change. Expectations were often unclear. So some teachers behaved as if the students had not been learning at home for an extended period of time. Some teachers and administration focused strongly on mental health and social emotional learning and wellness, and some focused straight on academics. Some administrations sent messages to teachers that they should be meeting certain standards and doing certain things, but not really giving them the resources that they needed. So teachers were and are visibly stressed, which was easily observed and felt by the students. I heard a lot about this in my office. So students also returned to a different world than the one they left when they were last in school. Some left their building in 4th grade and returned in person as a middle schooler. Some switched buildings. Some kids graduated and just simply never returned to secondary school. Proms, sporting events, school trips, these were huge losses to these students, and it did a lot to exacerbate their anxiety.
Lindsay, I'm going to give you a 1-minute warning.
I am done.
Oh, look at that. You guys are the best. All right. So we're gonna, and I appreciate that. Thank you. That was a great overview in a very short period of time. So now we're going to move on to Shari to just give a brief overview of what schools are seeing.
So I am kind of coming off of my role as the PPS director at Schalmont, and everything that Lindsey talked about, we absolutely have seen at school. You know, the biggest piece we see is absenteeism, kids not showing up. There's a lot of excuses by parents too, because as a parent myself, if my kid is having a panic attack or she's just really anxious and I see it, that how it's manifesting, I am going to let her stay home from school on that day, and we're going to try to work through that. It's not something that I take a really hard line with. I try to ease into it. I have two girls that both have diagnoses of anxiety, and one is older and is on her own, but I still have the other one with me. So in schools, I guess I see what we're seeing in schools. I see what the schools are demanding really of the students, because as Lindsey said, we did return as if nothing had happened. We're back into the classrooms. We have teachers that are putting the same types of demands that they did pre-pandemic on kids, and that's not working for a lot of kids. So our biggest issue is definitely absenteeism. We've done a lot of things to try and get kids to school, including having our counselors, social workers, principals, anybody that has a connection with the student, do a home visit, go to the home, talk to the family, talk to the student, try to ease them back in. When we do get kids in school, we see a lot of excessive sleepiness. They were probably up all night, anxious about having to come to school and having to be in that environment. So we see a lot of kids that are tired. A lot of avoidance, as Lindsey mentioned, whenever a subject starts, whenever some kids, even when there's a larger group of kids, if they're in a large class and they're having anxiety about pandemic fears, there's avoidance and they want to go to the nurse or go to the bathroom. We see a lot of increased visits to counselors. And I know at the school I came from, as well as others in this area, a lot of people have added social workers and outside counseling as well. I don't want to mention agency names, but specific agencies will have a counselor stationed at the school, and students that qualify for that can have that type of counseling, which also hooks in with the families. So we've seen an increase in that since the pandemic and returning back to school. A lot of kids that have the ailments of my stomach hurts, I want to lay down in the nurse's office, I have a headache, I need to get some water, you know, all of those kinds of things. That's anxiety can certainly manifest itself that way. The fear is very real. There are a lot of kids that even when I was still there in December at my district, a lot of kids, especially at the elementary level, that were wearing masks. Families want their students to be masked. There's a lot of questions and fear and confusion with kids about who's wearing a mask, why are they wearing a mask, should I be wearing a mask, why doesn't my mom think I need to wear a mask, am I safe, who's been vaccinated, should I get vaccinated? There's a lot of there's a lot of issues still around that talk about the booster shots and, you know, should I get, I was vaccinated, but I didn't get the booster for this new variant, and it's still all over the news, and kids are definitely exposed to that. Our current events classes at the high school and usually our social studies classes really take that on, and they do a lot of discussion with kids about how do you feel about that? What do you think of that? Should you be forced to have a vaccine if you're coming to school? What do you think? So there's a lot of confusion and fear, and kids, you know, adolescents are trying to grapple with who they are anyway. And now we throw this on top of it. So it's very confusing and causes a lot of fear for kids. We do see an increase definitely in anger. There's more fights. Kids are getting into trouble more because they're just reacting quickly. There's not a pause where people are thinking about what they're saying. They're very irritable. They get into confrontations, kids that typically would not have, but they're fearful and they're angry, and you know, all these things are hitting them all at once. So we're seeing definitely an increase in that. As the school district, I see at our high school especially, we saw a huge increase in kids that were getting suspended for silly things, for little things like, not that to minimize it, but for pushing someone in the hall or for exploding verbally at a teacher or something. We're seeing kids getting internal suspensions because the school really kind of went back to the way it always was. You don't do that to a teacher without taking into consideration, maybe there's something more going on here because of everything that these kids have been through. Poor academic performance, kids that are really struggling with doing the work in person. We get a lot of late arrivals. Kids call their parents, the cell phones are all over, and kids will call and say, can you come pick me up? I don't feel well. And the parent will come sign their kid out. I've done it with my own kid. She's like, I have a headache. I have a migraine. I need to take my medicine. Can you bring me home? And when I go get her and bring her home, it's not as bad as she made it sound. So I know that her anxiety kind of has taken over in a lot of those cases. We've seen a lot of requests for home instruction or remote. And the schools, as Lindsey mentioned, the schools have gone to no remote. We're not doing remote anymore. We're back in person. We're kind of back in business the way we've always done things. But we have parents that are requesting, could you just give her something to do online? She can't be in the class with all those kids. Her anxiety. The doctor's notes we get for extra support or for home instruction or online work, the doctors are writing notes saying, please, can you help this child? Been working with her for so many years, and I've had notes that cite specifically the pandemic has caused an increase in her anxiety and she's very fearful of COVID. Can she get some work to do online? So we see all those things that Lindsey was describing. We are seeing all of those things in school, and that's just to touch on it. There are other ways. It's not just a panic attack where somebody needs to go, talk to the counselor and hide in a room somewhere, which is what one of my daughters does. It's acting out and behavior that's not characteristic of that student, which is what the other of my daughters does. So, we've seen all of that run the gamut in school.
Thank you, Shari. I appreciate that. It's a pretty overwhelming list, and really makes you wonder with kids who have already experienced a loss of education because they were on home instruction. To go back in and then have all of these other factors at play is pretty overwhelming, which is why we are going to focus on best practices and what we can do about that. But before we do that, Marion is just very quickly going to answer the question, are there disability rights laws that can help students with anxiety?
Great. Okay. Thank you all. Thank you, Shari and Lindsey, for all the helpful information. And I am an attorney in private practice representing parents on behalf of students. And in the past decade here, even a decade ago, I've seen more mental health cases than other cases as the cases that need really significant interventions. And it's even, of course, as Shari and Lindsey pointed out, worse in the last decade. But yes, there are disability rights laws that help protect students with anxiety along the continuum. So it's very important for parents to know that these are rights students are entitled to. It's not something to be embarrassed about. There should not be stigma. And for school districts to know also. So there is a mandate to help all students. And I took this quotation on the importance of schools finding a way to help students with emotional problems attend school for the cases of severe school anxiety. And that was from a particular case, where a student was on home instruction in New York for about a year's period of time, happened to receive good grades on home instruction, but was not attending school for a period of time. And the district in this case had said, well, she's getting good grades. She doesn't need an IEP. She doesn't need special education services because the grades are good and there's no educational impact. But this particular court said, no, it's not an education if you're just home and not attending, if you're not able to attend for anxiety. And this particular student went to a therapeutic school because of that and received some funding from the district. So it's just important to note the obligation there are, and it can be very hard for districts to see the anxiety, it can be hard for parents, but there is this mandate, and I'll talk a little more about that. So the two laws we're going to talk about, which I believe a lot of you are familiar with, first is Section 504, a law that was first passed in 1973, which is an access law, an anti-discrimination law. And a lot of the students I work with anxiety, not everybody needs a 504, but if they are identified by a district, it may start with a 504. Because if you look at the standard for who is a student who's eligible for 504, it's a student with a physical or mental impairment. And an anxiety disorder can certainly be a mental impairment, or is a mental impairment. The question that comes up in a lot of the cases I work with is substantially limits. Does this anxiety substantially limit a major life activity? If the student is coming to school with a stomach ache, maybe even if it's frequent, but is able to attend classes, do homework, and attend and do well integrated, they may not have an impact that substantially limits a major life activity. But certainly a student who's missing a lot of classes, having trouble with assignments, seeing a decline in grades, it's that is likely to limit a major life activity. So it's a very broad standard under 504, and students generally under 504 will get accommodations, generally not special education services if they're not going to be goals for an IEP, but they can have things like access to counseling. It's access, it's not mandated regular. They may have attendance flexibility. They may have visits from home. There are a lot of general education interventions as well that can be done for students with anxiety. Extended time for assignments. There may be a go-to person if the student feels anxious, frequent breaks in classrooms. There's a lot of accommodations that can help. And again, for students with a 504, students with good grades can qualify because it's not the same standard as under IDEA with the adverse educational impact required. So it's important to understand the statute. It's a powerful statute. And again, this is something students are entitled to. It's not something that you're begging for, asking for, that this isn't something students should ask for. Now, or parents may ask for on behalf of students. Now, the Individuals with Disability Education Act, which was passed in 1975, is the comprehensive law that provides that each student with a disability will receive a free, appropriate public education. And sometimes with students with anxiety, there are disputes and just sort of misunderstandings or different lenses. I always tell parents, districts, and parents do have to work together collaboratively. There's very different lenses you see. You know, parents who are working with a student with anxiety are going to have themselves anxiety about their child and are going to really want to make sure the district does everything possible, and that this will, if they understand the law, will understand that they believe their child does need an IEP with specialized services, special education services, such as counseling, such as specialized instruction, such as a different placement, perhaps even a residential, depending on the severity. And districts sometimes will, because there are mandates from the state not to overclassify, may say, well, there's no educational impact for the student. Yes, they have an anxiety disorder, but the student is receiving passing grades. Student is attending more often than not, and we don't see that this is a disability that rises to the level of special education. And that does come through in some of the more difficult cases. But again, based on that MM case, from my perspective, a student can still be eligible for an IEP, even with good grades, if the anxiety does have an educational impact, such as that the student can attend school. I mean, I've worked with students who've missed school, who've, multiple years of not going to school, which is really an intractable, difficult situation. I'll talk about some of the strategies that I've used in those cases to help students and families, because it can be a very intractable dilemma what to do in those situations. So just to move on to the next slide on the federal laws, it is important to note that both IDA and 504 do have what's called the child find obligation, that even if parents do not refer their child to special education or for 504, school districts do have an affirmative obligation to identify, evaluate, and then to educate students if they suspect a disability, which would include anxiety or other mental health conditions. And that can be difficult because often students with anxiety, the last thing they want to do is tell everybody. They may go to school smiling, they often, because if you have that much anxiety, you're going to be afraid to show your feelings. You don't show any signs at school, then come home and may completely fall apart, hide in their room, cut themselves, do all kinds of dysregulated behaviors. And the school, because they don't see it, will say, well, we just don't see this. But if, that's one thing I'm going to talk about in the strategies, but parents really have to report this, and it's important to get independent, get to get evaluations done and to really show that even if it's invisible anxiety. And that's sort of the hardest part of some of these cases. Every student with anxiety may look a little bit different. It's not always a student who's nervous or stuttering or says, oh, I have anxiety. It's usually the opposite. The ones I see are just avoidant and hiding. But if someone approaches them, they'll say, I'm fine, I'm good. Just like my sons always say to me, just because it's the go-to default response often. And it does, this child find obligation, even just to identify and evaluate, does extend to all students, even if they're passing grade to grade. So in this section, we're talking about students who are not identified yet with a disability. But it is important to know that anxiety disorder can be alone a disability that does merit, in some cases, either 504 accommodations or special education services. And we'll talk a little bit about more what that looks like, as I said, later. And just to give you some of, under IDA, what two of the common classifications are for students with anxiety, either an other health impairment. The definition of other health impairment doesn't specifically list anxiety as one of the potential diagnoses, but it does, student with anxiety may have that limited strength and alertness, vitality, and that sensitivity to the educational environment. So that is one category that can be used. There's also the emotional disability. Just recently, New York changed fortunately, the term from emotional disturbance to emotional disability. So it does, just because it should not have that stigma, it shouldn't have any stigma. This is a student with a lot of sensitivity, and it only has to be one of these categories. A student can't learn due to factors that aren't just health factors or intellectual, not maintaining interpersonal relationships, inappropriate types and feelings in typical situations, sometimes a pervasive depression, unhappiness, or that somatic tendency to have physical symptoms or fears with school. And that can be, I have a headache every day. I've worked with students who have a headache every day. I mean, it's documented. It's not that it's not real. It's just that the root of it is from anxiety. Anxiety can do, doctors will tell you, I'm not a physician, but terrible things to your body, where your body, does manifest headaches, stomach aches, all kinds of illnesses. So that's another.
Thanks, Marion.
Okay, I think that's where we are.
It's a little bit of a prompt,
Yeah.
but I mean, this information is very helpful. A lot of this information is available in Special Education in Plain Language, which is a publication of the Special Education Task Force, and we can put that link in the chat. And I think you'll be able to weave some of this in the next section.
Yeah.
Before we go there, we thought we would run a poll now, and we're going to just do a series of questions, and I will read them out and the responses, but I'm going to give everyone a fairly short period of time to respond, but I think the information will be helpful. So Natasha, you have to stop sharing your screen.
Oh, I do. I think that's me. Yeah.
And then we will put the poll in. So can everybody see that poll? I can barely see it. Okay, so the question is, in what capacity are you attending this lunch and learn today? And you can check all that apply. The options are student, parent, school professional, service provider, attorney or professional advocate, or a mental health professional. And we are thus far seeing a majority of a lot of school professionals on today, which is wonderful because it's a school day. And so that's great news that people are attending and trying to get this information. I think, as Shari pointed out, it's a real challenge for school professionals as well as parents. We also have a noble showing by parents at about 20% and other service providers at nearly 30%. So I'm going to end that poll now and go on to the next one. Okay, that was the end. Are you doing this, Natasha? Okay, so the next one, very curious about this. what is the primary source of anxiety for your child or the student you work with? And I understand school professionals work with multiple students, but get either the most common thing that you see among your students or pick a student in particular. So this is a choose one. We have interpersonal social struggles with peers, bullying, including cyberbullying, interactions with school professionals, fear of COVID or other illnesses, fear of violence, or other mental health conditions such as depression. So I'm going to give everyone about 5 more seconds. Wow. That's interesting. Okay, so the most prevalent answer right now is none of these, that there is some other thing that is causing the anxiety for people. So I would encourage you to put that in the chat. Try to use short words, but put it in the chat because it would be helpful to everyone to know what those things might be. The second most prevalent here is interpersonal and social struggles with peers, which I think both Lindsey and Shari talked about. Bullying comes in at 7%, as does interactions with school professionals. Other mental health conditions such as depression weigh in about 37% too. Oh, and we have, so I'm sorry, I was reading we have a second poll that people also did too. So fear of COVID is still a significant stress for people. And then there is the none of these others apply. So I'm sorry I misread that, but we can move on. Is that all of them, Natasha?
One more.
Okay, one more. All right, this is a quick one. Does your child or student that you work with currently have an IEP or a 504 plan for a disability other than anxiety? It looks like the majority of about 64%, 65% do have an existing IEP or 504 plan, and about 1/3 do not. So that information that Marion provided about the ability to perhaps get some services under a 504 plan or the IDEA may be relevant to you. And I know that the specific strategies to do that will be discussed later. So thank you everyone for participating in that poll. And now I'm going to move on to talk about best practices and strategies. And we're going to start with Shari to talk about what practices her school district has successfully employed to address school anxiety for students.
What we try to do, and I'm involved in an agency. I'm also a teacher of the visually impaired, and so I go into some other schools as well. So I see some of the things that are happening. But one of the biggest things is really, I'll call it counseling and conversation. You really have to get kids to talk about what's bothering them, just as we do as adults. It's really important to have the conversation, to acknowledge what their feelings are, and not just the counselor. I'll kind of jump around this list, but all staff don't always buy into that. A lot of, well, I don't want to say a lot, but some staff members feel like, look, COVID's over, come back to school. This is how we always do it. You guys know better than this. Even our high schoolers, you know, they'll say you're in 11th grade or you're in 12th grade, you know, this is how we do things. But they don't acknowledge that this whole pandemic, as well as lots of other outside factors, have caused a lot of increased anxiety in kids. And, you know, I've encountered some professionals that don't even acknowledge that anxiety is a thing, that it's actually real, that they feel that it's just a parenting issue, that kids weren't parented strongly enough or things like that. And, thankfully those folks are becoming less and less prevalent, but they're still out there. And, anything you say to a kid, one comment that child perceives as negative because of what they have going on can really cause a big issue and can stay with them for the day or for the week or make them not want to come back to your class. So it's important to educate the staff as well of how to deal with kids that have anxiety, and that it may not look the way you think it looks. So having all those conversations, not just with kids, but with staff, pulling parents in as well, making sure that parents are involved, and not just the parents of the kids that may have the anxiety, but one of our elementary PTA groups does something called Coffee and Conversation with the principals once a month. And anxiety is often the topic. How can we support kids' mental health issues? Especially at an elementary school, which is typically smaller than our middle and high schools. When there's a student that's having an issue, a lot of people find out about it. It's loud, it's visible in the hallway. We have some increased social work presence in one of our elementary buildings that I work in. And it's important to talk to parents of other kids so that when their kid comes home and says, this is what happened, you won't believe what so-and-so did or whatever, they can have the right conversation with their kids about, look, acceptance, tolerance. Some people have different ways of dealing with things. Let's take a better look at this. So we want to keep those conversations with parents and adults. They're important so that everybody's speaking the same language to the kids, which is ultimately what we want to do. We want to make sure they feel acknowledged, that their feelings are acknowledged, that they're accepted, and that we want to work with them. We want to help them. Peer support is also important. We have a lot of groups at Schalmont that, I hate to even say this, but I went to Schalmont, and it's kind of like going back in time. The football players come running through, and everybody goes, oh, look, the football players. Oh, look, the cheerleaders. If those cliques and those groups are sending a good message to everybody else, it really helps to bring everybody together and not have those divisions of different groups of kids. And a lot of the social anxiety comes from not feeling accepted, not feeling like they're part of a group. So it's important that we take those students that are, for lack of a better word, popular, and pull them into this and say, listen, we want to have some conversations with the whole group. We've had a lot of success at our high school with assemblies and guest speakers, people coming in and talking about bullying and talking about their experiences as young people. And, they're motivational speakers. Some are sports figures. So it's important to get the support of all the different people in the community and all the different stakeholders and all the different groups of peers, so that everybody again is speaking the same language. We want to be a whole school that supports kids, so that peer support is important. I also see I don't see a lot of this, and I think we should see more of this because I've seen more success when we as adults are transparent. We try to protect kids a lot and say, oh, I'm not going to tell them that because I'm going to, it's too fragile. I'm going to protect him. Kids, especially as the older they get, but kids in general, they want to know what they're facing. They want to know what the truth is. So if the source of anxiety is a fear, go be honest. We don't have to dramatize things, but we should be honest and give facts of what's really happening. If we have a student that's afraid of the COVID virus, and we have kids that are afraid of vaccines, let's give them the facts and let them kind of sort through them. It's important that they don't feel that we at school are hiding anything from them. So I feel like the transparency, we don't see enough of that, but I think it really does help kids. They just want to know what they're dealing with. You can see kids just release a sigh of relief that, okay, I know what I'm facing now, whatever the situation is. When we have kids that won't come to school, we try to do small steps to reintegrate them. Maybe, listen, this is your favorite class. What if you came for the first 3 periods of the day And then we do a check-in with your counselor and we'll see if you need a break, if you can stay, if you need to go home, that's okay. But what if you commit to the first 3 periods? And we do it, a little bit at a time to try and get kids back to a more typical situation. We have a lot of kids that have success with check-ins too. So they get off the bus in the morning or they are dropped off and they go right into their trusted person, whether it's the social worker, the guidance counselor, the favorite teacher, whoever, the assistant principal, sometimes the principal, they go and they sit down and check in. Hi, how was your night? Oh my God, you won't believe the baby kept my mom up all night and was screaming. And, they just want to talk. And that's a really good time. And then the staff member would preset them for the day and say, I'm going to be here all day. So if you need anything, your lunch is period 5, come on over and let me know how things are going, that kind of thing. So those check-ins, that connection with people, I think, excuse me, are very important. We've seen a resurgence in the lunch groups, our social workers and school psychologists, and even beloved teachers that have a lot of kids that want to come in and do some things at lunch. They'll eat lunch in the classroom with those people and with the staff members and with other peers, but it's a smaller group and they chat and they talk to each other and it builds those social relationships and it builds their confidence. So we've seen a resurgence in those lunch groups just because it's kind of a natural way to get the kids back involved. Parent involvement, again, as I mentioned earlier, after school clubs, we've done a couple of extra club fairs the last 2 years that we've been back to school, where we get kids to come in and give them pizza after school and show them all the different clubs that we have and encourage them to be part of that. We really want to encourage them to be part of the social atmosphere at school, not just coming in and doing the work. As far as kids that have disabilities, that have a 504 or an IEP, we want to make sure that we're giving those accommodations in every class with fidelity. I have some kids that will come and say, my own is in fact, well, I couldn't go, I had to take the math test in the classroom because there was nobody in the support study hall room. So I don't think I did well. And the anxiety just went zoom up, right up the chain. We want to make sure that those things are first as far as importance. Don't cut those kids short and say, they can stay in the classroom. It's only a class of 18. They can stay in there. No, they can't. If that's on their IEP or their 504, they need to go. They need to have that safe environment. They need to feel like they are equipped to take this test. That's what happens when we see lower academic performance. A lot of times these accommodations are happening here, there, and if a kid is kind of happy-go-lucky in a class, like even in an art class, they're enjoying it. The art teacher might feel, I don't need to give those accommodations, and the kid might feel, I don't need them. It's important to say, yeah, you do. We want to make sure that you are on target here. We don't want to give you every opportunity that you need to level that playing field. So I think using those accommodations and any supports that we have with fidelity is important. And that's a conversation for staff to talk to staff about that. It's really important. It's not that you think the kid's on a grid roll today. Talk to the kid, talk to the parents, talk to the case manager. If it's really something that they don't need, we'll get to that over time. We need to prove that, but don't just make a decision to cut it out because it could really cause, more issues with the student.
Thank you, Shari. And that last point is such an important one because students, especially at the high school level, don't want to admit they need their accommodations. So, saying it or providing it when it's been decided that that's what the student needs and not saying, do you really need to go is right. Really important. And that's a major contributor to anxiety. So thanks for bringing that up. I just want to alert everyone that we're running behind schedule, and I do want to make sure that we have enough time for everybody to ask questions if they're able to. So we were going to devote some of our time together to talk specifically about bullying. I'm going to table that portion, and that will put us right back on track if Marion and Lindsey come in on their timeframes. But I am going to put a resource in the chat on a guide to bullying and students with disabilities that is very comprehensive and addresses students' rights, what to do at a CSE meeting, what to ask for, the type of accommodations that might be helpful to people. And perhaps that's something that we will offer in the future. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to best practices and strategies and give it over to Marion.
Thank you all. And I'm just going to start a little bit on the strategies because I talked a lot about child find and students without disabilities, that for students with disabilities who develop an anxiety disorder, it's very common. And I do think it's a best practice for districts to evaluate social emotional health every time you do a triennial or even every year. And there are rating scales you can use on the BASC-3 because every student has mental health, and often students do have social emotional needs who already have an IEP that are not addressed. So I just think it's important to note that as well. I'm just going to move on now to the other best practices slides. Hang on. Oops, just trying to go to the next. Oh, there we go. Okay. Now, I know Shari had talked about this a lot too, and a little bit about sort of the stigma sometimes that comes up, and both parents and districts, I think, should educate themselves on mental health concerns and anxiety, because there is still so much misunderstanding, even though there's so many wonderful educators out there and so many people who do understand it so well. But there are so many, I mentioned some of the barriers to understanding students' needs are very complex and sometimes invisible. The decline can be very fast. It can be in a semester. So students getting straight A's, and then the next semester they're not going to school at all. Some teachers or even parents may not see an anxiety. They may not know about it. They may not see it as a special education problem or a disability. That's sort of a quote. And then schools obviously are focused on academics, but the obligations are real. But there are trainings available. Schools, New York State has a lot on social emotional health benchmarks. Mental health is required in mental health and in the health curriculum for students. There is mental health first aid training so that staff knows what to do if a student is in crisis. Also, I'm on the board of the National Alliance for Mental Illness in Westchester, and NAMI in every county in New York has great resources for schools. I'm a presenter in Ending the Silence, which is on suicide prevention, but it covers anxiety as a mental health condition as well. So it is important, I think, that training and education for both parents and schools, and if students as appropriate as well. And again, just understanding the scope of anxiety may help lessen some of that stigma, because I think Shari and Lindsey talked about this, but due to COVID-19, there's such elevated stress, and there was a crisis before this as well. Lindsey talked about the changing learning environments, division over vaccines, so many sources of anxiety. And just the statistics are alarming. 1 in 5 students, even before COVID, have experienced a mental, emotional, or behavioral disorder in their lifetime, and that's even higher. And if these students are untreated and don't get the support, it can lead to even to poor outcomes, whether it's dropping out or more significant disorders, or just, sort of a lot of dysregulated behavior. And again, I just want to talk about this, another public health crisis, the very serious public health crisis of suicide in adolescents. And it is the second leading cause of death in young people ages 10 to 34 from the CDC statistics. So that's just important to note in the background of all this, because these are very significant, serious issues that we are all addressing. So I think on this slide, I think Shari went over these. These are to help students with anxiety. There are a lot of general education interventions or accommodations, and they can also be used for students who already have an IEP, but may not need another type of program. So these are all, Shari went over most of these, but these are all excellent and really crucial interventions for students who have anxiety, such as the building check-ins. Now, sometimes I think it's important for schools and parents to know these aren't always enough, because if it doesn't work for a student, the school district, can keep doing that. But if you keep doing the same thing without a different result, you have to try something else. And the law does provide for there's a continuum of services available. So parents, and an IEP, there can be perhaps integrated classes, co-taught classes may help, consultant teacher services, resource room. Shari had mentioned counseling. It's very important, critical, and how counseling has to really be effective. A lot of schools in Westchester are using, even in schools, DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, and mindfulness, those strategies in school-based counseling, even though it's not a full program, and that can be very helpful, just teaching students those strategies of mindfulness. There are special therapeutic support programs or special therapeutic support classes that some students may need. In Westchester, for example, a lot of the districts have developed their own therapeutic support programs where there'll be a dedicated staff to provide a safe space, a room where students can go if they feel dysregulated, where they're going to have, these staff are going to have specialized training in DBT and CBC. And be able to help students to have that they may have flexibility. They don't have to attend class every day. There are really some good models out there. Also, some of the BOCES programs have special therapeutic programs that the district would have to refer out to, but there are some good programs, calling TSP programs or therapeutic support. There are special schools, whether either private or other public schools, that districts can refer to as a CSE that do offer therapeutic support. And I have seen this be really needed and effective for some students. Sometimes home instruction is needed as an interim measure. We never recommend home instruction full-time for a student for a long period of time, but it can be needed while districts are looking for a placement. Some students do need residential programs where they need that 24/7 type of support. And there are some good New York State approved residential programs, private programs as well. And it's going to be, we're going to talk about some of the interventions, but that's going to be, need a recommendation. And, you don't want to be overly restrictive, but some students, if they haven't been able to attend school, may really need that. For example, some students can go from, this is sometimes even not being classified, to needing a residential right away without those steps in between, although there's a large continuum in between. So you have to look at the student's needs in that moment. And you're talking about students who maybe, suicidal, may have, that the emotional disability that is so significant, they need that 24/7 support. Unilateral placement, sometimes if New York State programs don't have space, parents will have to place unilaterally, and then they may seek tuition reimbursement, but that's a different process. But that does happen in cases pretty frequently in Westchester and New York City, because there just aren't enough state approved schools that are appropriate. We all know that. So just some of the best practices in addition to the special education continuum. As I mentioned, CBT and DBT therapy, parents can look at those privately as well as part of the school program. Sometimes schools can look at hidden learning disabilities, and if those are addressed, sometimes the anxiety of a student will lessen. We talked about IEPs. I talked about the therapeutic environment in the homeschool. Some of these I talked about. I just want to talk about, behavioral services. FBA is sometimes critical for students with anxiety, even if the behavior is all internalizing and avoidant. There's a BOCES program here in Westchester called BASIS, where there is an FBA developed for a student, and there'll be a person communicating with the student in the home each day if the student's not in school, to give interventions to help the student get to school, for example. So those are just some, sometimes a student does need hospitalization, and that's going to be the parent. But let me just go to strategies for some of the parents, because that'll come to that. Parents have to be obviously involved in this process and also respect the students' autonomy as well. But I think parents can educate themselves on early mental health warning signs. In general, there should be a private psychiatrist involved. I know it's very hard to find providers right now, but there are some, and just keep looking and wait if needed. But there could be medication needed. There could be private therapists needed for the student. Cooperating with the district is essential, and having that relationship of trust, which is sometimes hard when there's such a significant issue, but it is important to develop that trust. Sometimes parents do need to get independent educational, psychoeducational or neuropsychological evaluation, because it does delve into the sort of what the anxiety is and what the sources are. And again, working with the school is so important. Parents do need to know to call 988, which is the new 911 for mental health conditions. It's important to call that, or mobile crisis if the child is in danger. Because these are things that all have to come together really to help a student with severe anxiety. I mentioned, working with students who hadn't been to school in years, And then, but with all these steps, the good evaluations, with the right school support, with the hospitalization, with a good private doctor, they were able to get into a therapeutic program and then ultimately, attend and graduate with the right support. So it does happen. It can happen. It's important for parents at 18 to know that their child is an adult and they should be asking for HIPAA and FERPA releases. And good transition planning, because once the student has graduated, there is either college or post-secondary, and that's critical to understand what the intervention will be for anxiety. There's no more IEP, there would be 504 accommodation. Okay, so I think that gets to me to get to building this, so I can stop sharing now. Thank you.
Thank you, Marion. I appreciate that. So last but not least, we're going to turn back to Lindsey to talk a little bit about what parents are experiencing and how when a kiddo is feeling anxious about school and just exhibiting a lot of the things that we've talked about here today, and also how to interact with the school a little bit, or build communication with the school. So I will leave it to you.
So I'll run through this real quick, because honestly, strategies to manage anxiety are very, very simple. But sometimes people just need to have the seed planted in their head to realize what they need to do. So when you have a student who experiences anxiety that's coming in between them and what they need to do, it's best to try to identify the source. And as Shari and Marion have both alluded to, communication is super, super important. So all throughout this whole thing, communication is going to be key. So when we're identifying the source of anxiety in our students, it's best to approach with empathy. Try to understand what they're going through. Acknowledge and empathize instead of dismissing the anxiety. A lot of us, especially from certain generations, are prone to go to the "it's fine, you're fine, everything is fine." But if you try something like, "Wow, that sounds really hard," or "what was that like?" to try to get what their experience is, because you may think you know what they're anxious about, and it might be something completely different. So try to be flexible and meet this student where they are. Try to give them what they need, anticipate their needs, or let them communicate that with you, what they would like to see at home in order to make that a more comfortable environment. I forget who it was. I think it was Shari who mentioned that these kids, they hold it together all day. They want to do the best they can for their teachers and their peers, and then they come home and they fall apart. That's because home is typically where your parents are going to love you no matter what. So if they see the frustrated, hangry side of you, they're still going to give you a second chance instead of being like, "Oh, about seeing you the next day." Well, maybe they will, but so try to meet kids where they are and be flexible. Communicate with them. Keep an open line of communication and welcome what they have to say, what their observations are, and be aware of how you're responding to that. Communication with teachers and school staff. They have so many students, and you have really great information to provide to them. So even if you shoot them an email and say, "Hey, just to let you know, my kid's been super anxious lately. I think this might be at the root of it." You don't even need an email response, just so that it's in their head and they know, so they know what to do with it and how to respond to the student. Providing structure at home and routine is also a really huge thing. Anxious people like to know what to expect. And if they know what's coming, then they can sometimes pull the anxiety down a little bit. So if you can make your home as predictable as possible with a schedule, letting them know what comes next, and try to eliminate as much pressure and expectation as possible. If you don't need to be really focusing on something and lecturing about it, don't. Not everything needs to be talked about ad nauseum. Try to provide positive and realistic expectations. It's good to, challenge our kids and hope that they rise up to meet it. But sometimes we just need to adjust our expectations and realize what's realistic and what's not, because that will allow us to really have a chance at meeting our goals and expectations. Adults are the same way. Celebrate the small school-related victories, waking up and getting dressed, doing your homework without being asked. If you catch your student doing something that's good at all, name that, call it out. I love it when you do your homework without being asked. It's so great. Thank you. Give them time and space. So I remember coming home from school and my mom would be in the doorway. How was school? How was your day? And I never wanted to talk to her, and it made me cranky because it made me anxious. So can you give them time and space for processing? Let them walk in the door. If you think there might be some hanger at play, have a snack ready for them if you possibly can, or leave one out on the counter. Ask them specific questions once they're ready to talk to you. Hey, how was your English test? Or did anything awesome at school happen today? You can always really structure the conversation to go to the positive things instead of the negative as well. Identify relaxation techniques. This is huge for all human beings in general. So teaching your students as soon as you possibly can the things that make them feel relaxed. If you can identify the things that make you feel good and comfortable and relaxed, you can find those things and make contact with them more often in your life. So whether you're suggesting, you know, hey, you've had a long day at school, why don't you take a bath or a shower, or read a book that has nothing to do with school, or listen to music, or change your clothes, something that allows them to transition from the day that they've just had into a calm, relaxing environment where the pressure is lower is awesome. And then, you know, I like to also encourage parents to try to co-regulate when possible. So what this means is not only are you trying to get your student to be a little bit less anxious, but you're becoming less anxious and you're modeling at the same time. So, you know, giving them a hug and giving them that pressure, but also giving yourself that pressure, taking deep breaths together, doing some kind of activity, even sitting down and having a snack or a cup of tea or something like that can all be co-regulation, and it relaxes both of you. And then finally, I think that we've all been getting at this, make a plan. So it's always good for students who have anxiety to have a plan to know what to expect. So if they know that school is an overwhelming environment for them, maybe, you know, maybe the cafeteria is really crowded and they get overwhelmed when they walk in because of the noise and trying to figure out where to sit and the whole 9 yards. Try to make a plan for what they can do when they walk into that situation. Okay, you know, so-and-so is in your lunch period. Try to find them, or, you know, pick a table where you want to sit. Just try to make as many decisions ahead of time as possible so that they're ready when they get in there and the anxiety level goes up, they can still execute their plan. And this was also mentioned, but identifying a safe or trusted person at school, whether it's a teacher, a counselor, a lunch lady, a bus driver, whoever that person is that that child or student feels comfortable with, that is great. Maybe they can go sit with that person when they're feeling a little bit anxious. Maybe they can have that be a safe space for them. But just to know that you're not stuck in whatever anxiety inducing situation you're in is pretty huge. And I also wanted to touch base very quickly on school refusal, because I know that was something that people had suggested they wanted to hear more about. So my suggestions for that, a lot of what, you know, Marion was saying about like making sure you have a plan in place, learning school policies regarding absence, communicating with the teachers to access their work so that they can stay in the flow of things. I keep learning and educational activities up at home and try to stay along with the school schedule. At times, you know, this is when we're switching to ELA. This is when we're having lunch. That way, if they finally are feeling froggy and can get back in there, they can just kind of slide right in and already be on the schedule. And then is the district going to be able to offer any services to assist them? Is there tutoring that's available? Is there a partial day attendance? There are a lot of different accommodations and modifications that can be made that can be just treated very thoughtfully.
Thank you very much, Lindsay, and all of our panelists. This has been super informative. We are now kind of moving into that phase of asking and responding to questions from the audience. There was one question that talked about individuals who may be in that school refusal range who are no longer of mandatory age to attend school. Okay, so if they're a high school student, they're not attending, it's anxiety related, can the school disenroll them? Or what should a student do under those circumstances, or a family to support that student?
I don't know who you want to answer, Julie. It's okay.
These are open for everyone.
I mean, from my perspective as a parent attorney, I understand the New York education law does allow districts to disenroll a student based on non-attendance with particular notice. If the student has a disability, they still have a right to free appropriate public education, and I would view that as a denial of free appropriate public education. I don't think that's appropriate, but that's my perspective as a parent and student attorney. And even if the student isn't identified as having a disability, there are still those child find obligations. So I don't think that is a child-centered approach. I understand the law does allow that, and some districts may exercise that, but I do think that is not positive, and is certainly not going to contribute to that student being a productive member of society by being disenrolled. But that's my perspective. So.
I'm going to chime in and agree with Marion, even from my school district perspective. I don't think that's a child-centered approach either. And, we have these kids that have so many things going on. How's that going to help? And I always look at the big picture and say, what were you trying to accomplish? Were you trying to get them to come back to school by disenrolling them? Were you trying to win? What kind of an attitude is that? So I agree with you that that's not a child-centered approach. Those folks that are in school administration that do not have a special education background or a background working with kids that have any kind of mental health disorders may not agree with that. So, from a school district perspective, that's something within my own district that we would often debate. I get a notice from a high school principal saying that this is a student that's being disenrolled because they haven't come in, and we go as long as we could with just trying to let it ride and get some work done, but there's other ways to do it rather than just cut them off. So I would agree with you, Marion, that that's not a good approach. I think that districts should really work with parents and students. Even though we're not providing remote instruction, there's got to be something we can do. We've got to be able to get this kid back on track to at least get some work done, to at least continue their education. So I would encourage people to really think outside the box there and work on behalf of that student. And what do they need?
Okay, Lindsay, that was sort of a school question. I just wanted to throw out there too that for students with disabilities that have an IEP, if they haven't received a high school diploma, local diploma, or regent diploma, they are entitled to education until they're 21. And so even if there is a hiatus, of absenteeism, but then there's an interest in returning to school, they can be re-enrolled and eligible for services. So that's something to think about. One thing I wanted to share too is I remember at another pre-pandemic event on anxiety and students, it was pointed out that anxiety tends to be very cyclical too. It increases and diminishes, not only like within the same day, but over time too. Like you might be more anxious this month than you are next month, and there might be reasons for that. And so this wholesale refusal to go to school, we have to be careful to remember that this is cyclical and the symptoms can vary over time. And so a refusal 1 month doesn't mean that there isn't a possibility the next month or something along those lines. I hope I didn't overstep there, Lindsay, and I'm just going by recollection. Okay, so another question we've got, how sort of the opposite, how do we best support our students in scenarios where the school staff are the people recognizing and attempting to mitigate a student's anxiety, and the pushback or lack of response is coming from the caregiver at home.
That is a really hard problem, and I know Shari can jump in too. I think it's ongoing support for the parents, and I do see that sometimes even parents I work with who come to me don't recognize the need for the services, and I will educate them. And sometimes the districts are actually happy in those cases that the parent has counsel, because I will educate them on the importance, and you respect everyone's cultural or any kind of background they have on this. You have to give respect and trust and go to where the parents are too and start there. But ultimately, I think every parent does want their child to be successful, and explaining there's not stigma, there should not be stigma to this, and it's hard to do this, but you have to take it slowly and cooperatively and build that trust relationship. It's not easy at all. And I don't know if you have anything, Shari or Lindsey, but
Trust is really important. That's absolutely the truth. I've told this story before, but when I first started as the PPS director at Schalmont, the very first call I ever got was from Julie as the attorney representing a family in my district. It was brand new on the job, very first call. And, getting to know her through the years and other folks that work with her, sometimes I do suggest maybe you want to look for an advocate, maybe you want to talk with an attorney, because you need that other perspective, but you have to gain the trust of the parents. There has to be a good, solid level of trust between the parents and the school, because ultimately, I've had meetings where I've held up a picture of the student if they were a younger child and not with us in the meeting, and said, this is who we're here for. Okay, I'm not trying to win over you. You're not trying to tell me I'm not going to let that school district do this. We want to do something for this guy right here or this girl right here. So yeah, the trust is really, really important.
And in the meantime, there's a lot you can do to support that student at school that doesn't need to be official in an education plan. So I'd say you do whatever you can for them in school, and then, outside of school, exactly how Marion and Shari described it.
Yeah, I think that the question kind of correlates also with the result of that one poll, which identified, or in the chat, I think stuff going on at home as being the source of anxiety rather than stuff that's going on at school. And that is a problem we all know has been plaguing, again, pre-pandemic, and has gotten worse. So that building the bridge of communication between home and school, can be very, very important. Okay, how do we support students who have high anxiety? Sorry, just lost it. Who have high anxiety levels that manifest as disruptive behavior when it's really the result of anxiety? How do we go about that? And I'm going to ask Marion, do you think that in that instance that a functional behavior assessment and perhaps even a behavior intervention plan geared towards anxiety would be helpful?
Oh, absolutely. It would be extremely helpful in a supportive way. And because often that is the root of a lot of these behaviors, especially post-pandemic. The student is so anxious. I've seen in young students too, that we didn't see as much before, and the student just lashes out. I learned about a recent subset of autism called pathological avoidance disorder. I think that's
pathological
demand avoidance. I'm sorry. Yes. And that is, and often students who have that will then lash out. So I think both getting the medical and the diagnostic information and to inform the FBA is helpful too. So I think getting that, whether it's like a psychiatrist or a neurologist, and then also informing the behavior plan of the FBA in the school is often critical. And it can turn things around with the right supports, because students have different triggers and you may not even know. I worked with a student who didn't want to be praise would set them off, which nobody would think, so you don't know exactly, but I think getting that information is critical. So thank you. But FBA.
Lindsey, do you want to add to that? I have not heard of I didn't even hear the full term, so.
Pathological demand avoidance was what Marion was talking about. But behavior is communication. Flat out across the board, children, adults, and everything in between when you're not feeling right, you tell the people around you in different ways. Some of us use speech, some of us use our actions. And I think that looking at the student's behavior and asking for that FBA is a huge thing. Let's figure out what happened before that, before what we saw. Is it coming from anxiety? Does the student consider this thing that you just asked them to do is a demand that just feels too expensive at that point? So it's really important to figure out what's going on, what is the environment like, and what could possibly be causing the student to communicate in the way that they are.
Okay, that's very helpful. I am not seeing any other questions in the chat. I am seeing a suggestion that came right to me, so I'm just going to share it and see if anybody else has feedback. It might be helpful to have a part 2 to this presentation about the transition of these families with post-secondary goals. So kind of a focus on older students, the process for accommodations and the accommodations that are available post-secondary. Maybe this isn't related to this particular topic. That might just be, I asked for topics for future events, and that it might be that we just want to look at post-secondary education and what options are available out there for students in terms of supports and services. Okay, so unless anyone else throws something in the chat very quickly, I'm going to wrap this up. Unless anyone has any final statements, Marion, Shari, Lindsey, any last words you want to share?
I just wanted to add, first, thank you all for the great questions, for being part of this. And I didn't really mention this, and Lindsey and Shari can talk about this, but if you're either a caregiver with students or you're a parent, remember to take care. It sounds, taking care of yourself is really important, because parents, if parent is manifesting so much anxiety because of the child's anxiety, it's going to make things harder. So learning strategies and training yourself is so important, and taking care of yourself. And it's most parents have that, do not have that intuition, but that's critical. And anxiety can be lifelong, and it can, as you said, it can go on past 18. So this is something many families have to deal with long term. So just learning to live with it and understand it is really important. So that's just a non-attorney perspective. But thank you all.
Thank you, Marion.
Yeah.
All right, well, I want to thank each of you very much, because much more goes into this than I think people realize. That, we had meetings ahead of time, circulating ideas, putting together presentations, and it's very much appreciated. Obviously, this is a very important topic, and one that has, long-term effects on students and families and schools. So thanks much for your times. And also, there's been a couple questions about whether the slides will be shared here. We have 3 different slideshows. It's possible we might be able to combine them and make them available when we make this recorded presentation available. More information will follow on that. Again, please complete that evaluation that's going to be sent to you. It really won't take long, and it helps us tremendously in planning future events. I also wanted to acknowledge my colleague, Natasha Bryan. She is a law graduate who's been working with Disability Rights New York on sort of vaccine access issues, and has been fantastic, and really was the backbone of putting this whole event together today. So thank you very much to Natasha, and also Sabina Khan and others from Disability Rights New York. Everyone have a wonderful